You ever notice superheroes don't have arch enemies anymore? At least in the movies, that is to say.
He's barely a villain of the week.
How often do we see a reoccurring big bad whose relationship with the hero changes and morphs over time, where entry after entry redefines their relationship? One where their dynamic is based on some core fundamental disagreement that creates either a foil or a point of conflict.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
I can think of two examples in modern cinema that really continue the arch-enemy trope in modern superhero filmmaking. That being the Kingpin in Daredevil, and that's more TV anyway at this point, and Magneto with the entirety of the X-Men. Magneto is probably the only supervillain who is consistently defined in his various appearances by his changing dynamic with the heroes and mutants and humanity at large. These two relationships change over time. They are reoccurring. They are omnipresent. But often we see something different happening, even with characters we associate as the hero's arch nemesis. We see something strange occur. In traditional superhero storytelling, these two characters, the hero and his arch enemy, they might meet once or twice, if that, in some iconic film, and then never get mentioned again, or the ripple effects of their actions will have ramifications down the road. But we won't see them fight again and again and again, and change their dynamic like we do in the comics. What ends up happening is the arch enemy is typically a one-off villain, or they become absorbed into the arch villain of an overarching series of movies. There is Loki, who's an odd example. We'll get to him later. So what happened? Why are so many superhero films foregoing the idea of the archenemy? And what impact does that have on the cinematic superhero? And how might James Gunn's Superman and the MCU's Fantastic Four either buckle that trend or continue that trend?
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Yes.
To trace the history of the superhero arch-villain on film, you gotta go back to Richard Donner's Superman. Now, earlier adaptations from the old Captain Marvel serials to the old Batman serials in the 40s usually had maybe World War II propaganda as the big bad, or some incorporated antagonist therein. Superman vs. the Atomic Monster is actually the first on-screen appearance of Lex Luthor in a film like this. So it's a serial, but that's the first case of an arch-enemy from the comics becoming an arch-enemy on screen. When we got to Batman from the 60s, the Adam West series and the associated film, oftentimes Batman would face off against one of his many villains. Joker, Penguin, Catwoman, Riddler, etc. Egghead, apparently. When it came time for the movie in the 60s, they figured rather than give Batman a climactic battle with his most iconic villain, why not just get a bunch of them together and have them be the collective team-up of villains? Now, what's interesting, too, is while Batman's main arch-enemy is the Joker, as we all know, the main villain of the Batman movie is really the Riddler. He's the one really pulling all the strings and planning everything out. Joker is more of a henchman, essentially. Almost the muscle in a weird kind of way, which is counteractive to how he usually is in film and comics today. But when it came time for Richard Donner's Superman movie...
Is that how a warped brain like yours gets its kicks? By planning the death of innocent people?
No. By causing the death of innocent people.
He set up a singular villain in this film and set up a villain in the next film, Superman 2. Lex Luthor is the villain of Superman the movie, with General Zod appearing at the beginning to set the stage for Superman 2, which Donner was also planning on directing, and did direct some of before being removed from the production. The late Gene Hackman would appear as Lex Luthor in 3 of the 4 Christopher Reeve Superman films, as either the primary big bad or a supporting villain who spurred things on for the real villain of the film to take center stage later on. His relationship with Superman changed from film to film, but he served the same core role, though it should be noted that Lex only is a threat to Superman in the last third of the original film. The first 2/3 of it basically are more Superman existing in society and coming to in terms of his powers and becoming a stronger person as a result. But I digress. Superman 2, it's very interesting because he's more of a catalyst to help General Zod out, or he kind of weasels his way into the Zod storyline.
Revenge!
Revenge!
4, he takes center stage again at first, only to then succeed his villainy to Nuclear Man, the villain that's original to this film and not at all remotely like
Bizarro.
at all. Why, you asking? Nuclear Man has better nails at, of course. In all three of these films, Luthor is the villain. His relationship with Superman defines the conflict that he provides. He's always changing, always shifting, always adapting to the situation, with new characters to bounce ideas off of and new threats to push against with his brilliance and knowledge. But at the end of the day, Lex is the catalyst for everything.
Peace.
So the next major superhero film to come out was Tim Burton's Batman, one of the most iconic films of all time, at least in the 80s anyway. Batman sets a major precedence that many other films would follow. One that I think maybe didn't really help all that much. The villain needs to die by the end of the film. Joker dies at the end. Batman kills him, basically. And while there were plans to bring Joker back in a hallucination in the unmade fifth Batman film in the series, that never happened. Joker and Batman essentially make each other. They're responsible for the other's creation. But after Joker dies, Batman barely acknowledges Joker. There's a reference to him in Batman Forever, yes, but that's in relation to Two-Face and Dick Grayson's new arch-enemy relationship, and how that informs how Batman treats Dick Grayson and how he plans to mentor Dick to deal with Two-Face.
Your pain doesn't die with Harvey, it grows. So you run out into the night to find another face.
There's no chance of Joker coming back and causing more mayhem. No chance of them changing and developing over time. We see the momentum of their relationship take crux in the first film and come to a satisfying conclusion that leaves no room for continuation. There is no room for the trauma of the Joker lingering over Batman. And while I have made theories about how that movie impacted Batman's growth in future Batman films, that's not quite the same thing as Joker himself coming back again and again. As fans of the animated series and the comics can tell you, Joker's relationship with Batman is defined by the fact he never leaves Batman alone. He always comes back, always to push the grounds in some new way to upset the status quo that Batman has set up for himself. Without this status quo being established, it seems like something's missing from the Tim Burton and Joel Schumacher Batman films. A real arch enemy that comes back. It's always a new villain who always takes center stage, and they're always bigger than the last one. Seemingly, anyway. I do want to point out the next major film franchise for superheroes to come out after Batman was the X-Men. Blade doesn't count because he kills all of his enemies. He's a vampire slayer, though there was an unfilmed ending that was rejected that would have teased Morbius coming back. Obviously, due to rights issues, this never happened, and Morbius is safely defined by his relationship with Matt Smith's dancing guy in the Morbius film. I don't know what to tell you there. But the X-Men films, they established a number of villains who did reappear throughout the Fox franchise. Magneto, Sabretooth, Mystique, Stryker, and even the unseen Nathaniel Essex are reoccurring threats that impact the entire narrative across decades. X-Men remains, I think, the best example of how the arch-enemy can work and improve a story, because each reoccurrence of these characters allows these characters to evolve and grow. It's surprising how Stryker, bringing him back to the past, actually enriches the idea of Stryker as this omnipresent human force that ruins the lives of mutants. And of course, Mystique, while I don't like what they did with her in Apocalypse or Dark Phoenix, going back to the past and having her have this shared history with Beast, Professor X, and Magneto really helps enrich the story, and makes X-Men 3 more frustrating when Magneto just dumps her when she gets depowered. I think it's really stupid, and I hate that choice. I don't like X-Men 3. It's the worst one, in my opinion. In part because it makes Magneto, this complicated, nuanced character who's been developed over 2 films, into a generic bad guy who has to be stopped permanently by the end of the film. The fact that Magneto was stopped permanently actually is one of the changes that immediately got revoked, even by the end of that film, teasing Magneto getting his powers back. Because even Brett Ratner realized, without Magneto, you don't have a very strong movie, because his relationship is so compelling. It forces the X-Men to question, are our motivations good? Are our actions good? Are we really trying to protect a society that hates and fears us? Is that productive? Is that beneficial? Magneto says no, because society has feared and hated us for so long, we need to enact vengeance upon them. We need to take dominance. Or, interestingly enough in the films, at first, he tries to find a peaceful-ish solution by turning society, all of humanity, into mutants. Yes, it's an invasive decision, but it is less violent than his choice in X2, which is essentially eradicate all humanity using the weapons humanity built to destroy all mutants. You know, it's interesting. That inversion shifts the characters. And again, the idea of different arch enemies interacting and the two characters changing as a result, that's interesting, I think. I think there's missed opportunity in not having Emma Frost be this reoccurring villain from First Class into Days of Future Past. Killing her off between films reduces the growth Emma could have had, especially when you look at how Emma Frost grows in the comics, becoming first a member of the Hellfire Club, one of the most dangerous mutants alive, to becoming a dark parallel Professor X, training her own group of mutants to fight the X-Men, to becoming ultimately a part of the team under the Grant Morrison run, to having this antagonistic relationship with Kitty Pryde at first during their first couple of appearances, only to shift that over time and have Kitty Pryde depend on Emma, have the two form a mutual respect and development. That's interesting, I think. Even Sabretooth, who is defined by reoccurring in the comics again and again and ruining Wolverine's life, in the films has this interesting dynamic.
Well, well, well. Look what the cat dragged in.
I think X-Men Origins Wolverine's not a very good movie, but I love the dynamic that Sabretooth and Logan have in that film. And I really wish that we brought Sabretooth back in Logan at some point. There were plans to at one point to have Liev Schreiber return as Sabretooth, briefly, as like a broken old man, essentially.
Frankly, I'm a little disappointed.
I think that the villains for Logan work very well because it plays into the idea that humanity is ultimately the X-Men's biggest villain. But I do wish we saw Sabretooth again, as opposed to seeing them fight in Deadpool and Wolverine, where their interaction is reduced to a gag. It really undermines the effectiveness of Sabretooth as this reoccurring presence in Logan's life.
We're not like them.
But I want you to take everything I just said and compare it to
Spider-Man!
My name's the...
which killed off every major villain after the first appearance, with the exception of Harry Osborn, who's built up over the course of 3 films, only to, in the first instance of him being a villain, he hits his head and gets knocked out. Which, you know, great decision. Great choice there, buddy, to build this up and then give him amnesia. That was a smart choice. What's interesting is that throughout the trilogy and the Mark Webb duology, the big bad is arguably Norman Osborn. His presence exists throughout the entire franchise. It's Oscorp that funds Doc Ock in Spider-Man 2.
This is a breakthrough beyond your father's dreams.
It's Osborn's legacy and the psychic influence of the old Green Goblin that influences Harry to become a new Goblin.
First, we attack his heart.
In the Webb films, Norman Osborn and Oscorp are responsible for just about everything that happens, from all the villains' origins being tied in with Oscorp, to the very spider that bites Peter coming from Oscorp, to Norman Osborn's dark influence driving Harry to further villainy over the course of Spider-Man 2. Everything comes back to Osborn, which makes it so strange that Spider-Man and Norman Osborn only interact in one film. The very first Sam Raimi Spider-Man film.
Here's the real truth.
Bizarrely, Norman and Peter never interact on screen in the entire Mark Webb duology. In fact, Norman only has one scene on screen, and it's threatening Harry with the Goblin virus or whatever it is that he has. Like the weird genetic defect that he needs Spider-Man's blood to fix. Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a weird movie. I don't know what to tell you. It's just a strange choice of decisions made creatively. Now granted, Norman and the other villains would return much later in No Way Home, which illustrates several interesting ways characters can change and grow in reappearances, interacting with other villains. Hell, Norman in that movie swiftly establishes himself as Spider-Man's nemesis across multiple realities by ruining 2 different Peters' lives. In the case of the MCU Peter, he kills Aunt May, which is awful, but then he creates a scenario where Peter is forced to erase any reference of himself in society and in the memories of those around him, essentially unpersoning himself. I think it's interesting that Doc Ock and Norman have more interaction that grows both characters than Tobey Maguire's Peter has with Norman, reuniting with him again. You would think there'd be a good chance to have these two characters who defined each other's roles in society, have them meet in some way. But they don't, and it's kind of underwhelming. We do see Tobey's Peter stop Tom Holland's Peter from killing Norman. That's interesting, and it does imply some elements about their changing dynamic, but it's not as interesting as, say, a direct confrontation. Yes, it might usurp Tom Holland's Peter from the main character role temporarily, but it's a good character beat to have. And we know that because we see Peter interact with Doc Ock in a really great way. Hold on to that. Put in your pocket, we'll come back to it later.
Oh.
Unfortunately, a lot of the problems I have come back to the Dark Knight trilogy.
But I don't have to save you.
The impact of Ra's al Ghul and Two-Face is felt throughout the final film, The Dark Knight Rises, but both Ra's and Two-Face die before that film starts. However, two enemies are alive throughout the trilogy from previous films, Scarecrow and Joker. Now, Scarecrow, I think, is poorly utilized, becoming increasingly less of a threat over the course of the trilogy. Remember, Scarecrow beats Batman in their first appearance pretty easily.
Lighten up.
So he's then beaten by Batman pretty quickly in the next fight. And then after that, Rachel Dawes tasers him and knocks him out. Dark Knight, Scarecrow is beaten easily as an afterthought by Batman. And by the time we get to The Dark Knight Rises, Batman and Scarecrow don't even interact. He's beaten off screen. In fact, the fear toxin I don't think is even used. It's very underwhelming and a waste of a really good character with a lot of potential, as though being defeated once makes them impossible to ever be a threat later on. But I think the biggest disappointment from The Dark Knight is ultimately the Joker.
And here we go.
Yeah, Heath Ledger's real-life passing made it really difficult to use the Joker again. It undermined what potential role Joker might have in the third film. However, by that same metric, why did Nolan never even reference the Joker? There's no reference to the Joker in The Dark Knight Rises at all. There's reference to Two-Face, yeah, of course, so there is impact that Joker left behind him, but no one mentions a crazy clown in Arkham. Hell, better question, where the fuck is Arkham in these movies? Arkham is mentioned in the first film alone and never comes up in conversation ever again. Blackgate Prison becomes the primary place where all the bad guys are dumped to, and it's just a generic hodgepodge of criminals that Batman happened to put away previously, but nothing really else. And this results in a weird trilogy where Batman never has a main nemesis other than the League of Shadows, a vague conglomerate of assassins with a completely new roster and leadership and goal in each of its two separate appearances. It's almost like a totally different organization. There's not really much of a chance for their dynamic to evolve with Batman's. At least meaningfully anyway. I think it's interesting to compare how the League of Shadows changes from film to film to how Hydra changes in the MCU from Captain America 1 to Captain America 2. While they are run by different people, it's a different organization, it's all different, it feels like a continuation of what happened in the previous film. That Captain America's dynamic with Hydra has changed and evolved as time passes. Whereas with the League of Assassins, under Bane's leadership, it doesn't feel like it's changed since fighting Batman. It just feels like it's doing the same thing. Like they're back for a second go-around, but the League is secondary to Bane.
If I pull that off, will you die?
No, you.
Bane is the big bad of that film, and he's using the League as a generic army. It could be anyone. There's no reason to think the League of Assassins is the same group Batman fought in the first film, outside of being told they're the League of Assassins. If you weren't told that, you would have no idea, because there's nothing emblematic, nothing interesting, nothing distinct about the League of Assassins in The Dark Knight Rises. Least of all when Talia al Ghul shows up, and that becomes the real big bad of the film, at the last second. A secret twist villain that doesn't really do anything all that different, and her motivation is barely even revenge. It just seems like it's just continuing the villainy of the movie because it needs a villain. We never get a good strong sense of her motivations or thought process or anything. We're told a few things about her, but it's not demonstrated through the action of the narrative, what she's feeling, what she wants, and how her relationship with Batman establishes her as the true final boss Batman has to face. Hell, it would have been a better twist if Scarecrow was the secret big bad, because at least Scarecrow was there the whole time. His dynamic with Batman has shifted. There's a sense that there is some shared trauma between them. Their dynamic could change and evolve. That's what they do in the Arkham Knight game anyway.
League of Legends.
Death, then.
But if you want a death knell for the arch-enemy, the arch-enemy died in the MCU. Because, let's be honest, the films all but refused to bring villains back for a second appearance. And even then, if a villain does come back, they rarely face their original hero a second time. In the first 3 phases of the MCU, a small number of villains show back up a second time. There's Loki, of course.
Odin's son!
You had one job.
But really think, who else do you got? We got Crossbones, who's a minor villain in Captain America 2 and Captain America 3. There's Armin Zola, who starts off as a minor henchman in Captain America 1 before becoming more of a distant big bad in Captain America 2 as the guy who allowed Hydra to infiltrate S.H.I.E.L.D. There's Thunderbolt Ross, who starts off as a Hulk villain before becoming a lurking threat in Cap 3 and Infinity War. And of course, there's Thanos. Oh, and there's Nebula too, right? Nebula and Loki are the 2 most interesting examples in the first 3 phases of the MCU because they both return to fight their respective heroes, but also, over time, grow and mature as characters. Loki and Nebula's arcs are among the best in the MCU because they prove the missed potential so many other villains in the saga had. I also guess Bucky kind of counts because he was a villain in 1, but he was also a supporting character in Cap 1 and then in Cap 3. So I digress. Same with Scarlet Witch, at least in phases 1 through 3. We'll get to 4 and 5 in a second. But the biggest missed potential, I think, is Red Skull.
You don't give up, do you?
Because he ultimately does return, but he is cursed to guard the Soul Stone at the edge of time, basically. And while his legacy is felt through Hydra, he himself is not given a chance to reinvent himself as Cap's nemesis. Even when Cap returns with the Soul Stone, in his time-traveling adventures off-screen, we never see how Cap and Skull interact, and that's a shame. Red Skull helped form Captain America. Cap exists to fight the Red Skull. It's because of Red Skull that Cap lost his chance to be with Peggy Carter. Why not bring the Red Skull back in the modern era? Have them both be men displaced from time. Yes, I do realize that having 3 different people who came from World War II alive in the modern day with him and Bucky would be a little redundant, but Red Skull's an interesting villain who I think you can do a lot with. A guy who is unambiguously evil, he's unambiguously the bad guy, and you gotta deal with him somehow. Much like how I wish the Hulk confronted Thunderbolt Ross or Abomination after the Incredible Hulk movie. Because phases 4 and 5 saw a bunch of old villains coming back. Scarlet Witch, Abomination, the Mandarin, Thunderbolt Ross, Bartok the Leaper, Ghost, Taskmaster, and everyone Spider-Man ever fought. They're all back, and they're all fighting heroes they didn't face the first time. The only exceptions are Aisha from Guardians of the Galaxy and Mordo from Doctor Strange, though the Mordo we see in Multiverse of Madness is an alternate variant of the Mordo that we know. And in fact, Raimi originally filmed but then cut a sequence where Scarlet Witch would have killed the main Mordo. It's almost like, why bother having them at all if someone else kills them? It's weird. None of these reappearances give us a sense of how these characters and their rivalries have grown or shifted over time. Hell, it almost seems like with the Hulk especially, they seem deliberately like they're trying to avoid pairing the Hulk up with any of his old villains. Abomination shows up in Shang-Chi and the She-Hulk show, but despite showing up in She-Hulk, Bruce Banner never meets with Abomination. They exchange letters off screen, but we never get a sense of how they interact together outside of the finale that gets erased from time because of shenanigans. The point is, we don't see how the dynamic really shifted all that much. We get the idea that both Abomination and Bruce Banner are in better places now and are able to more calmly deal with their issues, which is interesting. I do like that idea. But then there's Thunderbolt Ross.
You have to know!
Thunderbolt Ross is completely disconnected from Bruce Banner in Phase 3 because Bruce Banner is off on Jeff Goldblum's world when Civil War is going on.
Tell me, Captain, do you know where Thor and Banner are right now?
That's in my brain now.
When Thunderbolt Ross returns, looking much more like Han Solo than William Hurt, we also don't see the Hulk interact with Thunderbolt Ross. Rather, it's Sam Wilson who becomes the antagonist, so to speak, for Thunderbolt Ross, though Thunderbolt Ross is now also defined by his antagonist relationship with the leader, who is a Hulk villain, who appeared in The Incredible Hulk and has no connection to Bruce Banner in this film, despite them being defined by their connection together. It's almost like Marvel is taking Hulk villains and shoving them onto other characters. It's very strange. As a result, we get this weird dynamic in the MCU where villains appear once, and they maybe reappear later on, but not facing the characters who define their rival. It's weird, right? And we get stuff like Ms. Marvel. Ms. Marvel's a great show. I love Ms. Marvel as a show. But the Clandestine aren't really Ms. Marvel's nemesis. It's just kind of a villain she faces in her show. Likewise, Moon Knight faces, I don't know, this guy. And it's like, okay, why are they fighting? What's the real dynamic there? When the show ends, you don't feel the sense of lingering anticipation to see them fight again, or it doesn't feel like this was anything more than a generic bad guy of the week. And the MCU does that a lot. Guardians of the Galaxy is pretty good, where each villain does seem to play into the themes and ideas of the movie that they're in, and they are effective villains. I think Ego is a great antagonist for Peter Quill, in part because of how he ruins Peter's life.
What?
No, all right. I know that sounds bad.
I think the High Evolutionary is one of the most chilling bad guys in the MCU's entire run, being this sociopathic monster who tortures animals, tearing their flesh apart and shoving machine parts in them just to see what happens. It's a man willing to blow up a planet and eradicate an entire population just to start over and try again. It's chilling and deeply disturbing. Also, a character like Ultron, a character who in the comics is redefined by coming back in new iterations, upgrading and developing. We haven't seen Ultron come back yet, though it is confirmed he will show up in Vision Quest, which, okay, that's neat. Hopefully they bring Ultron back some more, because I would love to see Annihilation play out on screen.
I suppose we are both disappointments.
I suppose we are.
I want to go back for a second to Spider-Man No Way Home, which I feel illustrates another great element of these characters through the interaction of Tobey's Peter Parker and Doc Ock.
Well, it's good to see you, dear boy.
It's good to see you.
See, that's something that often gets underutilized with the whole arch-enemy thing. Affection. There's an affection between Peter Parker and Doc Ock. Even though they confronted each other, there's a strong sense of love between them. In a way, Peter has always looked up to Otto Octavius. And in a way, Doc Ock sees Peter Parker as the man who saved him from a fate worse than death, being controlled by his metal arms. There's genuine emotion there, genuine heartfelt in that. And it feels nostalgic for us as fans to see these characters who we grew up with meeting again.
Trying to do better.
There's a sense of warmth there that is missing outside of the relationship between the X-Men and Magneto. Again, that's the thing. X-Men did it perfectly, in my opinion. Well, not perfectly. But you do see a sense of love. And that's so rare with arch enemies that we don't see too often. Usually it's defined by hate. But we don't see genuine affection between a hero and his villain's form all too often. It's one of the reasons why Shang-Chi with the Mandarin works so well, because Shang-Chi and his father do have a relationship that is based on love, based on respect, and that defines their connection so well.
Now it's time for you to take your place by my side.
It's not gonna happen.
It elevates the film as a result. And even with more antagonistic relationships between a hero and a villain, well, what's Holmes without his Moriarty, his equal, someone of respect who you can admire in terms of their skills and intelligence in some way? That's interesting. A villain does not have to be based on hatred or the drive just to stop them. There could be a sense of finally being challenged by someone who is an equal to them. Or maybe it's just a job. Being a bad guy is just a job, and there is affection on the side.
I was just in it for the bucks. I never meant for this to happen.
I want to go to one of my favorite moments in the comics. It's a scene in the Fantastic Four comics. Okay, so at the time, Spider-Man's villain, the Sandman, he was working for a group called the Frightful Four, which put them against the Fantastic Four. It's like a whole thing. And the thing gets put into a hospital at one point. And who should show up and just wants to talk? It's the Sandman. And he and the Thing share a six-pack of beer while just chatting, just shooting the shit. And it's a great moment. The Sandman isn't just a guy who turns into sand. He's not just a bad guy. He's also a human being. For him, being a criminal is a job. And once the job ends, he's just a guy. And it really serves to elevate the Sandman above just a generic jobber and just this human who has personal feelings, wants, needs. I know the Sam Raimi Spider-Man film also has the whole daughter subplot. That's neat too. But there's something more human, I think, than this melodrama. Just a small human moment. That makes you feel so much more meaningful to an audience than the sad, tragic backstory. And again, with Magneto, there's so many scenes in the X-Men films and the comics and cartoons and everything else. We just have Professor X and Magneto just sitting back and talking, conversing, discussing. And there is a sense of warmth, of respect, of a resignation that they must fight, but they don't really want to. And you can read into that however deeply you want in terms of what the relationship is. It doesn't change the fact it's one built on mutual respect, essentially. This is one of the reasons why Ultimate Magneto, at least in my opinion, is such a terrible adaptation of the character. Because Ultimate Magneto is just a villain. There is no love between him and Professor X. It's just hatred. In fact, Magneto breaks Professor X's neck in the comics. Like, there's no affection there. There's no love. He's just a bad guy. And that's much more boring than a more tragic, doomed rivalry. So we come to the modern cinematic landscape, and we got a few problems. We got Lex Luthor coming back as Superman's villain in the new Superman film. You might think that makes sense. Lex Luthor is Superman's biggest villain. It would make sense, right? Well, consider this. In the DCEU, under Zack Snyder, Superman was pitted against Zod, Batman, Doomsday, Steppenwolf, and almost Black Adam. However, Lex played the role of the instigator, pushing Superman to fight someone else. The same role he played in Superman 4, where he pushed Superman to fight Nuclear Man. I mean, you may say, oh, he planned everything out. Yeah, but like, who's the real force of conflict in that movie? It's Batman or it's Doomsday. Lex just instigates things to get us to that destination. And what stinks is that Lex has kind of shifted over time. He's become a villain for the DC universe more than he has become Superman's arch enemy. Not always in the comics. Of course, he's still the big bad in the comics for Superman. But in adaptations, you usually see him take on this bigger role that rivals the Justice League. And it kind of takes away from the fact that he, on his own, really wants to stop Superman. I think James Gunn's movie is going to recenter Lex as Superman's nemesis. And that's interesting. That's fantastic. And knowing how James Gunn is structuring this, I hope we see Lex come back again and again and again to antagonize Superman, to grow and change, to become that instigator he is in Superman 2 and 4 to an extent, but after giving him his time, giving him his chance to be the big bad, reintroducing and adjusting and growing the character as time goes on.
Who raised you as a child? I'll kill them too.
But by contrast, there's Dr. Doom, who we will see meet Reed Richards, his arch nemesis, in Avengers Doomsday, an Avengers film. Maybe Fantastic Four give us the beginning of the Dr. Doom and Reed Richards relationship, but it's not that in the first film. They're fighting Galactus there, who's a very different type of villain. Not one you have a personal relationship to, because Galactus is not a villain, he is a force of entropy, a force of nature. And it feels kind of weird, doesn't it? To have a hero face his arch nemesis, not in a solo story, but in a massive team-up crossover film. It would be almost as weird as having Lex Luthor introduced in a film where Superman fights someone else. See where I'm going with this? Ultimately speaking, Dr. Doom I hope is done really well. Doom is a little different in that he is established early on as a big bad for the Marvel Universe. But at the end of the day, he is Reed Richards' arch enemy. That has to be established. Without Richards, there is no Doom. You need that dynamic to be established to make it compelling, to make it interesting. The reduction of these characters makes it so that heroes are fighting abstract concepts more than specific faces who can come back again and again. They're not representative of a bigger problem. They are just simply villains of the week. We lose something when we do that. We lose something when we take away the Kingpin from Daredevil. We lose something when the Joker can't come back for a second match against Batman. Indeed, the Matt Reeves Batman film does something very interesting. Matt Reeves does not kill off any of the villains at the end of his film. They are all maybe coming back. In fact, with the Penguin, we explore how the Penguin's life goes on outside of Batman. The Penguin is arguably more interesting now than ever before in Batman's history because he was given time to evolve after his first appearance. Imagine what we can do with the Joker in this scenario, with Riddler. We can bring them all back and show them evolve and change in interesting ways. At least I think anyway.
And you know, Gotham loves a comeback story.
I think the future is bright if we allow superheroes to return to this older style of storytelling, with a big villain comes back again and again for rematches. Maybe not as the big bad of that film, but as a reoccurring presence. And even then, maybe like with Magneto and Stryker, we see how two different villains can impact the other to do something even more destructive at the end of their story.
Sonny, we keep running into each other.
Air combo.